What was really encouraging to me this morning as Graham was doing his children's talk was it seemed that he'd set me up brilliantly for what I'm about to say. Now, we hadn't chatted. I don't think he's been spying on me this week, but the very thought that he was talking about choices and plans, it feeds so brilliantly into what I'm about to say from this part of the book of Proverbs. It makes me think that maybe somebody else has a plan, which is, I should know that really. But yeah, it's really encouraging to know that God has his plans even in the choices that we make. Now, Proverbs, as I hope you've seen over the last few weeks that we've been going through the book, it's a very practical book, but it's also a very profound book at the same time. It speaks to us about our relationships. It speaks to us about how we deal with the poor. It guides us on how we bring up children, how we deal with anxiety. It's a book that really reminds us that life is made or life is broken by the choices that we make. If we're lazy or if we're diligent, it makes a difference. Who we listen to and who we choose to not listen to makes a difference to how life goes. It's potentially life-changing. And this is a book that says, if you are wise, if you are truly, truly wise, you build your life on a healthy respect and a healthy awe for God. You let him guide you and you place your future into his hands. That's why it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And today, hopefully this is going to be no different. We're going to be looking at what Proverbs says about our plans, so the plans that we make, how it talks about God's plans, and how those two things fit together. And hopefully we're going to see that it is awe-inspiring, how our plans and God's plans go hand in hand. It's awe-inspiring on the one hand, but it can be deeply disturbing as well if we're not trusting God. So, where to begin? Well, we're going to start with that first statement, that it's actually awe-inspiring when you see how your plans fit into God's plans. And if you are someone who likes everything nicely logical and everything tied up with all the T's crossed and the I's dotted, you're not going to find this overly easy. I just have to say it to start with. God's plans and our plans going together, it's not nicely logical to the human brain. We're going to see that. So, we're going to begin with a bit of human wisdom. This is something that I think we would all agree with. There's a well-known saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I love this thing here. Much work remains to be done before we can announce our total failure to make any progress. I love things like that. Okay. So, fail to plan and you plan to fail. We instinctively know that that's right. If you're faced with a decision, if you've got a situation, if you've got an ambition that you want to achieve, you know that if you've got a well thought out plan where you've taken the advice of others, where you've listened to their expertise and you've followed it through, you know it's more likely for your plans to come off. That's just simple wisdom to us. And the book of Proverbs reflects this. So in chapter 15 and verse 22, it will say this: plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Simply, that's saying be humble, get advice off other people, the right kind of people, good, godly kind of people, and if things work as they normally do, your plans should go well. That's what that is saying. And again, chapter 21 and verse 5 says something really similar. The plans of the diligent or strategic lead to profit, as surely as haste or the impulsive person comes to poverty. It's saying the same thing. Those who plan generally prosper. That's how life works. If you don't plan, don't count on your dreams coming true. If you don't plan things out, don't count on things going well for us. And this makes sense. I'm sure all of us would think, yeah, what the Bible is saying there, that makes sense. If you don't plan, things aren't going to turn out how you want them to do. Fail to plan, plan to fail. We get that. But if you were reading along with Jenny or listening, there may have been one or two things where you thought, hang on a minute, what did that exactly say? Now, there's one which wasn't in the reading, but it's one that could make you a little bit uncomfortable. So Proverbs 16, verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, simply this. Even the things that look utterly random to us, the small incidentals of life, the little things that occur, the toss of a coin, are part of God's plan, and he plans for how each and every single one of them falls. So the New Living Translation will put that particular verse into these terms, in terms of dice. We throw them, but the Lord determines how they fall. So every game of Monopoly that you've ever played, it's not your fault you lost. Every little detail, every coin toss comes out exactly the way God planned, even the smallest details of life. And we can't grasp how those two things go together. If you try to do it, your brain will probably explode. You choose, God determines how everything turns out. They don't mesh to us, they're oil and water. But to God, it makes complete and utter sense. The Bible teaches us that you are free, your choices make a difference, but at the same time, the smallest detail of everything is fixed by God. That's what it's saying. The Bible teaches us they go hand in hand, even though it looks like a great big fat contradiction to us. They're both true, and many parts of the Bible teach this to us. So in the reading that we had, Proverbs 16, chapter 1, this will tell you that your plans are yours, but God determines things. So your plans are your plans. The plans of the heart belong to man. So your plans are yours. You own them. Your choices are yours. They belong to you. You are not simply a puppet that dances to the tune of God. You make plans. You choose to do things. God does not force you to do anything. You choose. Verse 9 says something very similar. The heart of man plans his ways. You freely choose to do everything that you do. And so any consequences that come your way, they're down to you. They're down to you. You are rightly accountable for the things that you say and the things that you do. So if you do something wicked, if you do something foolish, if you do something cruel, you own that choice. It belongs to you. You can't push it back to God and say, he made me do it. He didn't. It's your plan. Yet at the same time, in a way that we can't grasp, your words and your actions are fixed by God. Nothing catches him out. Nothing falls outside of his plan. So it says, the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. It says, but the Lord establishes his steps. Your choices are yours, completely and utterly, and fixed by God at the same time. And we have no way of working out how those two things go together. We just simply have to say the Bible teaches it, they go together, we can't suss it out. Now that might feel a little bit uncomfortable. To know that life works like that might feel uncomfortable to you. But I want to say something. Life working like that actually allows you to relax. It allows you to be as free as you possibly can be. And I want to show you how with the help of three characters. Because at the moment you might be thinking, that makes me a puppet or something like that. I want to show you how this way of things working is actually brilliant. So, three characters from three films. The first one is John Costler. He was a character played by Nicolas Cage in the film Knowing. Anyone seen that film apart from me? A few. Okay, a few of you have seen that film. Now, in that film, this man's son is going to school. They're opening up a time capsule and taking things out. His son gets a piece of paper which is covered with numbers. It's 50 years old, and initially, this fella up here has no interest in the numbers at all, none at all. But then he spots something. He recognizes that one cluster of numbers has the date of the September 11 attacks, the number of casualties, and he comes to work out it's actually giving the coordinates as well. He then backtracks through the whole paper and realizes that it contains the coordinates, the dates, and the amount of people killed in major disasters going back 50 years, all written down before any of them happened, in chronological order. He then spots something else. Three of them have still yet to occur. Three of them are still yet to occur. So what does he do? He tries to prevent them from happening. But no matter what he does, no matter what action he takes, he's utterly powerless to prevent them. Utterly powerless. His choices are meaningless, and you could argue that for one of them, he helps cause it. So no matter what he does, things just happen. His choices are irrelevant. That's the first character to get in your mind. Second one is the great literary character, Dr. Emmett Brown from Back to the Future. At the end of the third film, he's giving a speech to Marty McFly, who's just seen a piece of paper which seemed to outline his future erased before his eyes. And then he says this: "Your future is whatever you want to make it to be, so make it a good one." He says, "You and you alone determine your future. It's all in your hands. Make it a good one." And then the final character, Forrest Gump. At the end of the film Forrest Gump, he's standing by a grave and he's reflecting on two people who've had a massive influence on his life. Lieutenant Dan, who thought everyone had a destiny and everything was fixed, and his mum, who believed that life was what you made it and it was your choices that determined everything. And he says this: "I don't know if Mama was right or if it's Dan. I don't know if we each have a destiny or we're all just floating about accidental like on the breeze. But I think maybe it's both. Maybe both is happening at the same time." Now, let's look at how life works for these three characters. If you believe the world works like the first one, the Nicolas Cage character, where everything is determined, your choices are meaningless and irrelevant, how does life work for you? Well, you're powerless. Nothing you do makes a difference. Everything is determined. You'll try to do the right thing, but your heart won't be in it. You'll be passive, you'll be bored, you'll be cynical. If you see someone whose life is in a mess, what are your choices going to make to their destiny? They're going to make no difference at all. If you're a Christian, you might feel indifferent because you'll always be thinking, I can't do anything. Because if God hasn't determined it, it makes no difference. All of your plans will have no meaning to you if everything is determined like that. On the other hand, if you're like Dr. Emmett Brown, which I guess is how most people in our world think, we want the future to be unwritten in front of us. If you think life works like that, if you really, really, really think about it, you wouldn't do anything either, because you would still feel powerless. Now, that might sound a little bit strange, so let me illustrate. I recently read something where someone said something along the lines of this, and it's a good exercise to do. So think of who you were 10, 20, 30 years ago. If you're not over 30, I envy you, but go pick one of those numbers. Think back to yourself at an earlier age and ask yourself this question: are you more mature today than you were back then? Now, my guess is every single one of us is saying yes to that. We are more mature today than we were back then, probably. Now, when I think back to myself in my teenage years, I do this and I start to think, I think 80% of the things that I wanted out of life were probably wrong. 80%. When I was 17, 18, 19, 80% of it was wrong. I was foolish and utterly unequipped for the choices that I had to make. The really disturbing question is this: what's my percentage today? What percentage of things that I want today are wrong? What will the version of me in 20 years' time think of me today? If my destiny is all down to me and my choices and my ability to get it right, then I'm simply never experienced enough to get it right. Never. Never, ever, ever. If it's all down to me, I might get it wrong, and if I really thought about it, I probably wouldn't do anything. And even in doing that, I might make a mistake. In fact, I've watched someone who was so paralyzed by this thought that he might get something wrong and was so indecisive, he actually destroyed what he really wanted. There was a man I used to work with. He'd lived with his partner for 20 years, yet he never quite knew if getting married to her was the right thing. While she wanted children, he thought, yeah, I do want to have children one day, but he wasn't sure whether it was the right time, whether they had enough money, whether he was equipped to be a parent, so he never made the decision. He put it off, and he put it off, and he put it off, and in doing so, he got it spectacularly wrong. Because one day, she'd had enough, and she left him. And for him, that's destroyed his life. He looks back at his choices and says, I made a complete and utter mess of it. If you think your destiny It's all down to the choices that you make. You never know whether any decision you make is the right one. You never know whether it's right. You never know whether it's going to make your life or whether it's going to break your life. Instead, the most practical way to live is in what the Bible teaches us, because it tells us, in Forrest Gump's words, it's both at the same time. Admittedly, we may need to make it a bit more focused than he does. We actually need to say, yeah, it is God who has a plan. It's not just floating around on the wind. But it's teaching us that if you're a Christian and if you're trusting God, your plans are yours. They're really, 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 really yours. But they're part of God's plans, who's in charge of absolutely everything. So it's not that your plans have no connection to what happens to you. It's not that your plans determine what happens to you. Your choices relate to your destiny, but God holds it in his hands. That's what it's saying. And if that's how things work, you can actually relax. You really can. You can have the incentive to make decisions and go for things and to take a risk or two, because you know that whatever happens, even if it goes wrong, even if to your mind it turns into a mess, it's in God's hands, and trusting him, it will all be okay. And even when things go wrong, this perspective even changes that. So look for a moment at chapter 16 and verse 4. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. What's that saying to us? It's saying this: bad things are part of God's plan. Not in the sense that he does bad things. So if someone does something bad, if someone does something wicked, that plan belongs to them. It was their choice. But he is so incredible. He's able to weave that choice into his plan so that good comes out of it. In the end, he can bring good out of bad. Now again, we might not understand how that's so, but we get some pretty big examples of it in the Bible. So in the Old Testament, there's the story of Joseph and his brothers. They are a deeply dysfunctional family, but they're great material for a musical. And the dad plays favourites. The dad has got his favourite son who he lavishes things on. Lavishes, coats, everything. He gives him the lot. The brothers bitterly hate the golden son Joseph. They hate him because of this. And Joseph, who, because of his treatment, he is arrogant and he's proud. So what do the brothers do? They decide to do away with him. They've had enough of him. They want to get rid of him. Firstly, they plan to kill him. And let's just look at Joseph's life, because this is a catalogue of things going wrong. They plan to kill him. They sell him into slavery instead. Whilst he's a slave, even though he's godly and honest and reliable, he's accused of rape. He's thrown into prison and he is forgotten. That's a whole lot of bad things happening to one person. Yet later, the tapestry of his life is weaved in such a way that he is in the right place at the right time to save his family and others, countless others, from starvation. In the end, when the brothers come to meet him, what does he say about their actions? Those words on the screen. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Their bad action was ultimately in God's hands to bring about great good. So even the negative, even the confusing things, if God's got a plan, they're part of his plan to eventually end in good. If things seem to have all gone wrong, if your life seems to have gone down the toilet, it's not because God's not at work. It's not because he's not interested. It's not because he doesn't care. It's an encouragement to trust him because he's got plans and he's got purposes. He intends even the negative things for great good. And I know, even as I say that, I know that some of you in the room, quite understandably, are looking at your own lives and you're saying, you've got no idea what you just said, Chris. You've said bad things work for good. And you are thinking of some massive, painful memory and asking the legitimate question, how's God going to bring good out of that? It's a really legitimate question. How is there a plan in that pain and in that memory? And I have to be honest enough to say, Specifically, I've got absolutely no idea. So if you're thinking of a memory from the past, if you're thinking of a situation now and thinking, how does God bring good out of this? I have to be honest enough to say I don't know. But in exactly the same way that Joseph, languishing in a prison cell, didn't know. But there is going to be a purpose there somewhere. There definitely is. Because there's a real precedent. There's a bigger story than Joseph, which tells me that bad things can work for good. And it's when the most imaginably bad thing in history happened. And God's used it for good. We remembered it a few weeks ago. At Easter, God's pure, perfect, innocent Son was taken and whipped and insulted and punched and falsely accused and unjustly convicted and sentenced to death by a mob who owned all of their decisions, so that the creator of the universe was murdered by his own creation, which I think is probably the blackest, darkest act that can ever happen in history. And out of it, God brings immeasurable good. If he can turn the darkest event of history into good in the end, he can turn anything to good in the end. In Proverbs, in the life of Jesus, in the life of Joseph, they all encourage us, make decisions freely, but do it with peace, knowing that your life is in the hands of God. That's what they say. So having said all of this, how do you make choices? So for instance, imagine tomorrow you have 2 job opportunities placed before you. Imagine that happens. Which one do you pick? You might be single, and suddenly someone comes into your life and you start to wonder, hey, could I date this person? Could I marry that person? Or do I stay single? Life is full of big decisions and life is full of small decisions. How do you make them? How do you make them? This is where this perspective in the Bible is so helpful, because it frees us. Quite often, when we have big decisions as Christians, we look for a sign each and every time. God, show me your will. So you might pray and flip a coin. I've done that in my past. That wasn't a very good thing to do. You might flick the pages of the Bible and put your finger in and say, maybe God's guiding me through that verse. How do you do it? How do you do it? Now, sometimes God does give really clear, really obvious guidance. Sometimes he does it. But other times it's not so obvious. He doesn't tell you what to eat for breakfast. He doesn't tell you which socks to put on. He doesn't tell you whether to use your indicators in the car or not. He doesn't tell you all the decisions you have to make. What do we do when he doesn't give clear guidance? When you've got 2 job opportunities and you don't know what to go for? When someone's come into your life and you don't know whether to go out with them or not, what do? You do something a bit contrary to how we're wired. So look at verse 3 of chapter 16. Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. What that's saying is this, that first sentence. Commit every action in life to God first and you will make better plans. Now that verse, we might think we know what it means. So we might read it something like this. We commit our plan to God. We go to him and say, I've got this plan, Lord. There's this person who smells really nice. Bless my plans, Lord. Bless them. And then we hope that he does. But actually, it doesn't say anything like that at all. It says, commit your work, commit your deeds, commit your actions to the Lord first, and he will turn you into a person who makes better plans. It's saying, don't wait for the guidance. Do what's right. Do what's right to start with. It's a proverb that says to you, you need to draw a line in the sand and commit everything into God's hands before you decide to do anything. To go to him and say, I will do whatever you want me to do. And then when choices come your way, you can make them because you know that even if it does go south, there's a bigger plan which your life's just a part of. There's a bigger plan there. That proverb that's on the screen says this to us, that our attitude should be one where we say to God, from this moment, I'm going to obey you no matter what, in everything. I'll accept anything you send me, whether I understand it or not. I'll trust you, whether I understand the circumstances of my life. In Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 6, very similar thing. It says this, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Quite simply put, that's saying trust in him and go with the direction that God is taking things rather than swimming against the tide, and he will direct you. In all your ways, acknowledge him. And that is the challenge. In all of your ways. In all of them. Not in some, in all your ways. There should be no parts of your life where your decision making is nicely quarantined from what God has to say about it. So maybe just ask yourself as you look at those words on the screen, are there any areas of my life which I don't turn over to God? Any decisions that I make where he doesn't guide me? If there are, that verse would be saying you need to fix that. So if it's a relationship, for instance, if it's a relationship, what do you need to do? You look at what God says about relationships to start with, and you say, in all my ways I submit to you, and I acknowledge you. And then you pray, and you ask for clarity, and you do what's right. So this means when a decision comes your way, what do? You try and understand everything that God has to say about it. So, like I say, if it's a relationship, you look at what God says. You might get advice from people who are godly, and you listen to them, and you find out what they've got to say at the matter. And then you simply choose. You don't have to sit there waiting for God to give you a great big flashing sign. You simply choose. Because if God is in control of absolutely everything, and you want to make a decision in line with his will, then you are standing in the middle of his guidance and the middle of his will at every moment of your life, because he guides everything. Everything that happens to you is God's plan. You don't need a sign, you just need to make a choice. It simply says, if it goes wrong, you can then trust that God is preparing you for something else. If you make a choice to the best of your ability and it doesn't pan out the way you thought it was going to, God has simply got a different plan that he's helping you to find out about. And looking at life this way says this: don't spend ages looking for peace about a situation. Sometimes as Christians we say this: I've got this decision to make and I need to have peace about it before I can make a decision. Your emotions are sometimes the worst guide you can possibly have. If Jesus based his decisions upon his emotions and whether he had peace about it, there is no way he would have gone to the cross. He would never have had peace about going to the cross. He simply chose what was the right thing to do in the moment. And in terms of making decisions, as Forrest Gump would say, I think that's all I have to say about that. Trust God, make a decision, know that he's got a plan. Ultimately, it comes down to realizing your choices are really, really yours. You own them. You own them. But God determines everything. And if that's true, then the issue actually becomes this: history has a direction. It's not just random. The universe has a purpose. And like the ocean, there's a tide you can go with, or there's a current you can swim against. If you choose to go against the tide of history, don't expect things to go well. So if you know what God says about something and you deliberately decide, I'm going to go the opposite way, don't expect that to end well. Just don't, because why should it? But if to the best of your ability, you try and follow God, in the end, it will be okay. You're free to choose. At the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua gets the entire people before him and says to them, choose. So we're back to where Graham was in his children's talk. You really can choose. He says, choose who you will serve. And God says that to us as well. It might be you aren't a Christian. And you think, well, if God's in control, what can I do? My choices, I can't actually make them. He still says to you, choose. You do really, really choose. And he would say, you will own the choices that you make. You will own them. And at any moment, you can choose to go with the tide rather than against it. And if you go with the tide, you're like that surfer. Sometimes the wave carries you and it goes brilliantly and you end up at the beach. Sometimes it knocks you off. But the tide is still with God and there's another wave which will take you where you got to go. To Christians who are half-hearted, God says, choose. Commit to me in all of your ways and you'll make good plans. He says, choose today who you'll serve and hold nothing back at all. Let's pray. Father God, sometimes we look at your word and we don't really understand how everything goes together. But what we see in the book of Proverbs and in the life of Joseph and in the life of Jesus is that people freely choose to do things. We freely choose to do things. And somehow in a way that we can't possibly understand, all of those choices fit into your plan. All of them. And so we would ask that today you would help us to make better plans. That we would first of all realize that we cannot go to you and say, our choices don't matter, that you made us do something, because we own them. Help us to see that. Help us also in the moments when life gets really difficult and we don't understand what you're doing and we don't know what your purposes are. Help us to see that you do have plans and you can bring good out of bad in the end, because that's what you do. You have plans and you have purposes. But above all, Lord, help us to be those people who acknowledge you in all of their ways. And we would ask that if there are things that we have in our lives where we don't follow you completely and we know it, that first of all you'd help us to turn from it and to commit everything to you. And then, Lord, help us to be free. When we're in the middle of a situation and we don't know what to do, help us to know that you're in control and that you give us the strength to simply choose, whether it feels right or whether it feels wrong, whether we know how it's going to end up or whether we don't. Help us to choose and to trust you, because you have a plan, you have a purpose, and history has a direction. Help us to go with the tide rather than against it. And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.